Hello, welcome back to my channel. Now, earlier this week I did a live cast when I talked about the top 250 films from the Sight and Sound poll. They poll critics every 10 years for their 10 best films. And Sight and Sound have drawn up a list of the top 250 films voted for. And as I was going through it, I kept thinking about the omissions, films that weren't there. Films that always used to be part of these lists and have just been forgotten. Or popular classics that I thought would be there and are not even mentioned. And I've drawn up a whole page list of them. And there could be many more. This is not an inexhaustible list by any means. So I just thought I'd go through them and say what I was most surprised by. Now, number one, there is a major popular classic missing from this list that used to be standard issue. It was always there. It was, for many, many years, it was the biggest box office film of all time. So big that it actually had its own tourist industry built around it. In Atlanta, Georgia, my mum and dad went on the tour. It is, of course, Gone with the Wind. You know, duh, 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 duh. Tomorrow is another day, or whatever. You know, and Rhett Butler going, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. You know, all that stuff. Remember that? That was one of the biggest movies of all time. It was always on these lists. I don't particularly care for it myself. But, you know, as a popular classic, it was there. No longer. From the same decade, King Kong. You know, the British critic Gilbert Adair rather wittily said that King Kong was everyone's 11th favourite film of all time. I think that's a brilliant quote. It sums up the special place of that film in people's hearts. He also said, and I think this is a very clever piece of observation, it's the first truly cinematic myth. You think about it, Nosferatu is based on literature, Dracula. Frankenstein is based on literature. You know, all of these, you know, they were coming from plays, they were coming from theatre or literature or opera. King Kong is the first original cinematic concept. You know, the first thing that, you know, that is completely new and original, this great big ape on top of the Empire State Building. It's not just important in terms of its development of special effects. It's important as a movement forward, a quantum leap forward in film as a popular medium. And yet, not even mentioned. There are other popular classics, right? You know, Casablanca is mentioned, Blade Runner is mentioned. I've said before on this channel that there are movies of generations where older people think, what's the fuss about? Younger people don't get into it. But in that generational moment, those films are really important. Like for my dad's generation, Casablanca was really important. Right in the middle of the war, you had this story of romance and intrigue, right? In my generation, that film was Blade Runner. You know, older people thought, what's all the fuss about? Younger people, you know, prefer Blade Runner 2049, the scum. But, you know, for my generation, that film hit a chord. Well, for the 60s generation, surely that film was The Graduate by Mike Nichols. It doesn't feature on the Sight and Sound Top 250. I was surprised by that. No 12 Angry Men. While we're talking about popular classics, you know, Raiders of the Lost Ark and Jaws both feature, but no E.T. Surely one of the best children's films ever made. No Schindler's List. And while we're talking about films about the Holocaust, no Night and Fog by Alan Ronay, which used to be a regular feature on these lists. I find that quite extraordinary. What's happened to Walt Disney? There is not a single Walt Disney film on the list. There is Japanese animation. You know, there's Miyazaki. Not a single Walt Disney film. Think how important Disney was to the formation of sound cinema. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Pinocchio, Dumbo, Bambi. You know, Eisenstein. Walt Disney was his favourite filmmaker, or at least one of the filmmakers he most admired. This was a key figure in the development of cinema. He doesn't even appear on this list. In fact, American animation in general doesn't appear. There's no Tex Avery, no Hanna-Barbera, you know, no Chuck Jones. Okay, that's probably understandable because they were making little short films, but they were geniuses of their kind. That whole American animation world has been ruled out. What about the American musical? You know, now Singing in the Rain is there, but it's come to stand for a whole genre. There's no Fred Astaire. You know, apart from Singing in the Rain, no Gene Kelly. No popular musicals like West Side Story or Sound of Music. What's happened to Busby Berkeley? Busby Berkeley used to be one of those fascinating figures, from the early 1930s, who all cinephiles had a sort of soft spot for those huge, elaborate geometric patterns of, girls in, swinging their legs, in geometric patterns all over the place. That used to be one of the standards of art, popular art, but no longer mentioned. No Laurel and Hardy. There's Charlie Chaplin, there's Buster Keaton, but no Laurel and Hardy, no Sons of the Desert or Way Out West. I'm rather sad about that. Coming up to date, other popular classics, there's no Titanic, there's no Shawshank Redemption, a film I hate, but a lot of people love it, but it doesn't feature here. There's nothing by the Coen brothers, there's no Barton Fink, no Miller's Crossing, there's no Big Lebowski, which is a very popular film. I would have thought that would have been in there somewhere. David Fincher, no Seven, no Zodiac, which a lot of cinephiles really like. No Tim Burton, I mean, no, Tim Burton's crap, but there's no Tim Burton. Very interesting. There's nothing like Gladiator, that doesn't feature. But The Matrix does. I found that those omissions quite interesting. No Clint Eastwood westerns. Unforgiven, which was a rare Oscar winner, which cinephiles and the public liked, doesn't even feature. I was curious about that. No Terminator. Alien is in there, but Terminator isn't. Halloween. Now this brings me on to the horror film. Halloween is like the perfect machine of a horror film, right? John Carpenter's The Thing is in there. And in terms of horror, you've got Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Suspiria, The Shining, but there's no Halloween, and there's no The Exorcist. Now, if you've watched the channel for a while, you know that I don't like The Exorcist. I think it's a grim, rather exploitative film, but it's an incredibly popular film, a major film in the horror genre, Mark Commode's favourite film, if you remember. It doesn't feature, yet Suspiria does. There's no Rosemary's Baby. I find it curious that those films aren't there. You know what else? There's no Universal horror. There's no Frankenstein by James Whale. There's no Hammer horror. That whole British horror is eliminated. There's no like Dracula by Terence Fisher. I find that curious. I would have thought they would have come in the list somewhere, at least down in the 250s, Let's think about counterculture cinema in America, right? Now, you look at any film history. What's the major start of counterculture cinema in America in the 60s? Yes, Bonnie and Clyde by Arthur Penn. That does not feature anywhere in the Sight and Sound list, nor does the real start of counterculture cinema, as far as I'm concerned, John Borman's Point Blank. That's not there either. I was amazed by that. Five Easy Pieces, Bob Raffleson. Doesn't feature. When I was at film school at college studying movies, one movie they always showed you, right, was Clute. Do you remember this film, the Alan J. Pakula film with Jane Fonda? It's a sort of thriller. It's got Donald Sutherland in it. It's a kind of early feminist masterpiece sort of thing. They always like showing that film. I thought that would be in there somewhere. Not mentioned. None of those kind of conspiracy thrillers are mentioned, like All the President's Men. That doesn't make it either. What's that about? Let's talk about documentary. Documentary, Sight and Sound did a sort of backup poll a few years ago on favourite documentaries. And what came through very strongly was that the documentary is falling out of favour. And we're seeing the rise of the essay film, the more personal documentary, the more subjective truth, rather than this idea of objective truth, like Grierson, for example. So that whole British documentary school of the 1930s, Grierson, Cavalcanti, the GPO film unit, things like Night Mail, things like Song of Ceylon, that has been eliminated from the canon. It's not there anymore, right? But also eliminated from the canon is Robert Flaherty. That name's almost like a marginal name. If you looked at any list of the major works of cinema up to the early 1970s, Flaherty would absolutely be there. It would be unthinkable not to have him. Nanook of the North, which is often considered the first documentary, Louisiana Story, Man of Aaron. These were canonical works of cinema. They've vanished. And also there's no Frederick Wiseman. There's no Marcel Offals, no Sorrow and the Pity, no Hotel Terminus. Incredible. When you look at the documentaries that are there, like Patricio Guzman's film, Requiem for the Light, is it? I can't remember the title. Really? Are we saying that that's better than the films of Marcel Offals? More important to the development of cinema than the films of Robert Flaherty? I find that extraordinary. Let's come over to Europe now. Let's come to Britain. There's a few British films, sort of classics, that are not there that surprised me. Kind Hearts and Coronets, Robert Hamer. That used to be considered one of the wittiest and cleverest British movies. The Third Man's still there. Powell and Pressburger is still there. Brief Encounter is still there. No Kind Hearts and Coronets. That shocked me. No Brighton Rock. That shocked me. The films of the Corder brothers, like Rembrandt with Charles Lawton, those movies have completely vanished, haven't they? No one cares about them anymore. Let's go to France. The Nouvelle Vague, still very popular with cinephiles, right? So Truffaut's in there, Godard's in there, Rivette, Roma, Agnes Varda, Alan Resnais, Chris Marker. No Chabrol. No La Femme Infidèle, no Le Boucher, no La Cérémonie. Poor old Shabbers. Is he really not that interesting a director? Another thing that I thought was interesting, right? Jean-Pierre Melville, his wonderful film about the resistance, L'Armée des Ombres, The Army of Shadows, is in there, but not Le Samouraï with Alain Delon, which I thought he'd be better known for. I thought that was his most iconic film. During the livecast, many of us commented on the decline in interest in Renoir, Jean Renoir, who used to be the heart of everyone's discussion of humanism in cinema. And now he's slowly sliding down the list. I noticed that films like The Golden Coach were not even mentioned. Another great humanist in French cinema, Jacques Becker, is not mentioned. Casque d'Or is not mentioned. Fascinating. Also, I've never been the greatest fan of Jacques Demy, but he appears twice in the list for Les Parapluies de Cherbourg and Les Demoiselles de Rochefort, but not Lola, which I would have thought was his definitive film. And I know many of you out there, you've spoken to me about how much you love that film. I was quite surprised not to see that even mentioned. Now let's go over to Germany. Now, Paris, Texas is in there, and that's clearly a very popular film with my subscribers. But none of Wender's early work, which already got him noticed. There's no Kings of the Road, no Alice of the Cities. I thought that was a bit strange. Kings of the Road, that's a major film, surely, of the 1970s. Not even mentioned. I tell you who else is not even mentioned. Sieberberg. One of the most important directors in German cinema, and he's not even mentioned. The reason is because everyone suspects him of being very right-wing. That's the real reason. And staying with German cinema, as you know, I have my issues with Werner Herzog, but The Enigma of Caspar Hauser, that used to be highly considered as a movie, not even mentioned. Now we move further east, and I think the most disgusting thing about this list, the thing that most enraged me, is the total ignorance of Eastern European cinema. Polish cinema, Czechoslovak cinema, Hungarian, Romanian. It's almost entirely absent. Even popular classics like Ashes and Diamonds by Andrzej Wajda is not there. There's no Miklos Jankso. I was astonished. I mean, I could just be here all night. No Markéta Lazarova, which is often voted as by Czech critics as the best Czech film ever made, by František Vlašil. That's not there. The only film that stood out to me was Vera Kytalova's Daisies, which of course survives this ignorance because it's directed by a woman and now has feminist critics pushing it. But there are no other critics pushing other great, Eastern European work. It's such a rich area of cinema. I was disgusted on behalf of those countries. Let's go to Russia. Sergei Eisenstein. Eisenstein still gets noticed for Battleship Potemkin. That used to be a regular in the top 10, Battleship Potemkin. But not Strike, not Alexander Nevsky, not Ivan the Terrible, not October. They were also all standard issue things that used to appear in these polls. Only Battleship Potemkin makes the list. And while we're talking about Russian directors, no Sukharov, who many people consider to be the heir to Tarkovsky, the most important Russian director since Tarkovsky. And there's no Russian Ark. When Russian Ark came out in the early 2000s, it was a big cinematic milestone because it was the first film that was done in one shot. And people, even people who weren't real cinephiles, went to see it. It was like, oh, wow. It's all one shot set in the Hermitage, in St. Petersburg. And it's a kind of a relation of Russian history, a kind of abstract, off-kilter relation of Russian history, with that beautiful, very moving, very strange ending, with that endless ocean, and that voiceover saying, we carry on, we keep going. Of course, Sakharov is not in this list because he's considered to be a Russian nationalist. But, also for those people who follow Russian cinema, Kalatazov, The Cranes Are Flying, I Am Cuba, not mentioned. Extraordinary. And just before we leave Russia, let's go back to Tarkovsky. No Solaris. Now, I've said in my video about Tarkovsky that I think Solaris is one of his weaker films, but it is brilliant, and it's much loved, and it's one of the great science fiction movies. 2001 is in there, Blade Runner is in there, Metropolis is in there. No Solaris. Also, none of those kind of classic 50s B-movie sci-fis like Invasion of the Body Snatchers are mentioned. Interesting. And finally, just quickly down to Portugal, Manuel de Oliveira, major filmmaker, not a single one of his films mentioned. Let's cross over to China now. Jia Shankar. In the 2000s, Jia Shankar seemed like the most important director currently working. He seemed to be where cinema was going. I remember in 2010, CinemaScope, the Canadian magazine, the best magazine in English at that time, they did a poll of the best films of the 2000s. Platform, which came out in 2000, won. That was a huge film. I remember going to see it at the time. Now, Jia Shankar is not even mentioned. In 15 years, you got a film that was voted as the best film of the decade, and in 15 years it doesn't even register in the best, 12 years actually, because the poll was done in 2022. Been forgotten. What happened to Jia Shankar? That's pretty cruel, isn't it? Let's go over to Japan. You expect Kurosawa to turn up, don't you? You expect Mizoguchi. You expect Ozu. Where's Mikio Narusa? Often considered the fourth of the four great Japanese filmmakers. Doesn't make the list. What's his most famous film? I think the title in English is Drifting Clouds. That doesn't make the list. I'm surprised by that. There's no Oshima. No Ai no Corridor. No Boy. That's the film from 1969. Those films don't register. Very interesting. Now I'm going to just dot around. There's certain cinephile cult items that don't register. Number one, which blew my mind. I can't say that I'm a fan of this director. Weirdly, his last film, Saga of Anatahan, is actually my favourite film of his. But in the past, if you did a list of major films and works of cinema and you didn't include Joseph von Sternberg, people would think you were stark staring mad. None of his Marlene Dietrich films are in the top 250. Der Blue Engel, one of the great German masterpieces of the 1920s, Emil Jannings and Marlene Dietrich, does not feature. There's no Shanghai Express. There's no Scarlet Empress. That's extraordinary to me. What has happened to Joseph von Sternberg? Why has his critical, collateral fallen so low? Another figure who doesn't appear, right? There's no Greta Garbo. Now, Garbo was one of those few stars in cinema who was as important as a director because of the special charisma and quality she gave to a film. She was the biggest film star of her time, right? One of the most important people in cinema. Doesn't appear. There's no Queen Christina. There's no Ninochka. While we're talking about Joseph von Sternberg, and German films like Der Blue Engel, Murnau's Faust. Sunrise appears, but not Faust. Interesting. There's no Shane, another popular classic. No Anthony Mann, which I find a bit sad. I'd like to say there's no Valerian Boracek, but I suppose that's a bit of a personal taste. Being There, the Hal Ashby film with Peter Sellers. I don't like that film very much, but it's a very popular classic film. A lot of people love that film. I was surprised that didn't make an appearance. None of the Val Lewton horror films. Cat People, a major American film, doesn't appear. Night of the Living Dead. I should have mentioned this with the horror films. That was the start of the midnight movie, the grunge horror film. Just as important as the horror film as Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Yet it doesn't feature. That surprised me. Another cult item, there's certain cult, amongst really serious cinephiles, there's certain cult movie items that are sort of like, your stuff, you're one of the boys. One of them is Lola Montez by Max Offals. That used to be one of those films that French cinephiles in Paris in the 50s and 60s got really excited about. And, if you liked that film, you were one of them. But most people didn't like it because they didn't understand how brilliant it was. But Lola Montez has vanished. No one talks about it anymore. Gun Crazy. Joseph H. Lewis, one of the great B movies. Another film that gets cinephiles very excited, or at least it used to. That's gone. Orson Welles. There is Citizen Kane, there is Magnificent Ambersons, there is Touch of Evil, but where's the fourth great Orson Welles film, Chimes at Midnight? Surely that's as good as the other three. And Welles' most personal film in a way. I was amazed by that. And finally, if you were a cinephile in the 70s or 80s, a serious cinephile, you carried your Sight and Sound rolled up and your Screen magazine and you went to every repertory screening at the BFI, who was the most important director of the time? Jean-Marie Straub. Oh yes. Jean-Marie Straub and his wife Danielle Huillet, they were the kiddies. They were who the leftist intellectuals thought was the state of the art of cinema. That was the real McCoy, Jean-Marie Straub. Not a single Straub film in the list. The Chronicle of Anna Magdalena Bach, usually his most popular film, not even present. Yet his great disciple, in some ways, Pedro Costa, is in the list with In Vander's Room, which is a very difficult, I can't believe that it appeals to that many people. In Vander's Room. It's quite hard. I haven't seen it, but I know it through Pedro Costa's other work, and it's quite a tricky slow cinema film. Yet Straub, who was his kind of godfather, who he made a film about, very good film, doesn't appear. That, in some ways, is even more shocking than the absence of Sternberg. So that's by no means an inexhaustible list, and I'd love you to chime in with the films that you were surprised not to see, because there are so many, but those were the ones that really struck me.